How's it going, guys? Conviction 454 here, and in this video I wanted to kind of make a follow-up on the 5 skills needed to break into IT video that I made recently. So this particular video is going to focus on how you can actually get started with setting up your own IT home lab. Now, for those of you who are new to IT, you may struggle with trying to figure out, like, how do I actually get started with developing the sort of hands-on experience that I'll need in order to, learn the skills that I need to even stand a chance at getting a job, or really just learning the fundamentals. So this video is going to cover that. So this video is not going to be too long. I just wanted to go over just how you can get started with setting up the lab. So we are going to use a few resources. We are going to use a software called VirtualBox, and then we're also going to install some virtual machines. Now, if you're not familiar with what virtual machines are, just think of them as like logical downloadable versions of operating systems that are packaged into, in this case, what we're going to be using is called an ISO file, and that ISO file essentially contains the crucial components needed to run the OS. And the two virtual machines that we're actually going to be downloading are Windows Server 2025 and Windows 11. Now, for system requirements, I would generally recommend that you have at least 16 gigabytes of RAM. Whether you're using a laptop, desktop, doesn't really matter. And then VirtualBox is pretty easy to run overall. So what we're going to do in this video is actually go over like where you can access the virtual machines, how to actually set up the virtual machines, and how to install VirtualBox. So the first thing I'm actually going to do is go to Google Chrome, and I don't think I have VirtualBox on this particular laptop, but I know I have it on some other devices. But anyways, just type VirtualBox, and then what we want to do is, if you're on a Windows device, of course you go to Windows host. If you're on Mac OS, if you have an Intel Mac, which is, I believe, anything from like 2016 and before up to a certain year, but I forgot. And then of course, it's available on Linux as well. So what we're going to do is focus on the Windows version. Alright, VirtualBox is installing. Okay, and then what we're also going to do is we're just going to look for a Windows Server 2025 ISO download, which more than likely we'll just find from Microsoft's Evaluation Center. I'll also leave the link for this in the description. So download the ISO, and then what you would typically do is, you'll leave out some information here. So in this particular case, I'll just fill out this form. Don't have to enter anything for the company name. You can enter anything. Just entering a generic phone number here. Alright, and then I think this is optional, and then from that point just click download. Whichever language you want it in. So I'm just going to download the 64-bit ISO version, and then what I also want to do is do the same thing for Windows 11. So we'll do Windows 11 Enterprise here. Again, same thing, just fill out the form. Country code. Okay. Alright, so 64-bit version. So once all of that is installed, it looks like this is going to take a few minutes. So what I'm actually going to do is pause the video, and then I'll come back. But once all of this is installed, what I'll do is go over the process of actually setting up VirtualBox and how to actually showing you how to set up each virtual machine. In this case, we're only going to use 2 of them. And then, once we get them all set up, then I'll show you what Windows Server actually looks like from the inside, and the actual core things that you want to focus on when it comes to starting off in IT and just really understanding what skills are going to be necessary. So, yep, once this is all finished, I will be back. Alright, so everything is installed now. So what we will do is go on ahead and proceed with the VirtualBox installation. So once you get here, it'll take you to the custom setup menu. What you're looking at here is essentially a set of files and drivers that VirtualBox will need to run. So we've got one for VirtualBox USB support. So essentially, if you have any USB devices plugged into your device, but you want it to communicate with the VirtualBox hypervisor, then you would enable this and then also choose like where you actually want it to install. So here you've got will be installed on local hard drive, or entire feature will be installed on local hard drive. So yeah, we'll go on ahead and select that option for USB support. Yeah, same thing here for VirtualBox networking, specifically. For this particular lab, what we want to do is focus on, I would say, bridge networking. Now, it's not necessary to have it on bridge networking, but you can also you can use NAT networking as well for this particular lab if you want. But I'll explain a little bit more of that in detail later. Then you've also got VirtualBox Python support, but really, if you want to, once you get to this screen, you can just click next. Yeah, so during the installation, Oracle VirtualBox will temporarily disconnect from the network, so that's fine. Just click yes. Missing dependencies, just click yes, and then just add the shortcuts. You can leave all of that checked, click next, and then actually go through the installation process. So typically this doesn't take a long time. Yeah, so let me see if it's worth pausing the video or not. Okay, yeah, so it's finished. Alright, cool. So once VirtualBox is finished installing, it should come up and you should see this menu here. So of course, starting off, you're not going to have any virtual machines. So what we're actually going to do is create our first virtual machine. So what I'll do is click new, and then we will give our virtual machine a name. So we're going to start with the Windows Server 2025 one. So just call it Windows Server 2025, and then look for the virtual machine. Hold on a second. Yeah, it should be VM folder. Okay, yeah, my bad. So what we want to do is select the image, and usually what you would use that for is if you have multiple virtual machines, then you'll go in there and then select the folder, and then it'll be there. So shoot, which one of these? I think it'll be the top one. Yeah, it says server evaluation right there. Sorry about that. As for the OS version, VirtualBox doesn't have like the OS version to natively go up to Windows Server 2025 yet, but this shouldn't affect the installation. Now we're going to talk about unattended install. So essentially what unattended install is unattended installs rely on a configuration file that enables the automated installation of your operating system file, so that you don't have to manually go through the process of actually installing the VM manually, or installing the OS manually in this case. But in this particular case, we are not going to go with the unattended install. And then let me see if there's anything else that needs to be changed. Nope. Alright, so we click next. Now for memory. Now for Windows Server, what I recommend is that you use at least 4 gigs of RAM. So go up to 4,000 plus megabytes, because I've experienced issues where if it's less than 4 gigs of RAM, as a matter of fact, for this particular lab, I've got 32 on this desktop, so I'll just go up to like 6. But I would use at least 4. And for the number of CPUs, from what I've experienced, anything below 4 can give some pretty wonky issues. So what I'll do is, for the sake of the lab, I think this computer has like 8, so I'll just use 4. For the disk size, I recommend if you can do 50, do 50. If you want to do more, that's fine. For lab purposes, I don't recommend anything more than 50 though. So, well, actually no, I'll go with like 75-ish. Yeah. All right, and then that should be all of the basic settings that you need to actually set up the Windows Server VM. So now what we would do is actually go into the settings of the virtual machine just so I can talk about a few things. So first, what we're going to do is talk about boot order. So one thing to keep in mind is that when you're installing the virtual machine, you're going to be going into the boot menu and booting into the optical drive first. That's what's actually going to install the OS. But once the OS is actually installed on the hard disk, then what you want to do is come in here and switch this over to hard disk. Now VirtualBox, I believe, does this automatically for you now, but if it ever gives you any issues with actually just booting up the OS for some reason, then what I would do is actually, first of all, disable floppy altogether, and then start with optical. Once you actually install the OS, then just switch the boot order to have hard disk first. Okay, so beyond that, we don't need to worry about like number of virtual monitors or anything like that. You want to turn off audio, which sometimes can actually help the VM perform better. And then for networking, what you want to do ideally is set your adapter to bridged adapter, and the reason why is because if you do want your virtual machine to have networking access, then essentially it's going to use the adapter that your desktop uses and bridge that to the virtual machine's network adapter. That way you can get an IP address from whichever home router that you use, if that makes sense. So your ISP will typically distribute IP addresses out through DHCP so that you can access the internet, and so that enables your virtual machine to do that, because you're talking about two different instances here. You've got your desktop that you're running VirtualBox on. VirtualBox is called a hypervisor, by the way. I meant to mention that before. And then the hypervisor also has an operating system on top of that. That's what we're installing now. So what I would do is go on ahead and switch this over to bridged adapter. And then beyond that, that is all of the settings that we need to worry about for now to get started with the HomeLab. So now what we'll do is actually just start Windows Server 2025. Shouldn't take too long. And then once we get to the point where I'm actually like installing the core operating system files, I'll probably pause the recording again. So from this point, it'll look like a pretty standard like Windows operating system installation. Windows Server does look a tad bit different though than something like Windows 10 or 11. So now we will just wait for that to come up here. Alright, yep, select the language, English. Then we are installing Windows Server. I agree to everything. Alright, so what we want to do is install Windows Server 2025 standard evaluation desktop experience specifically, because if you just do standard evaluation, then you're not going to have the actual GUI that you need, or graphical user interface, in order to actually like manually deal with Windows Server and not have to rely purely on command lines. So what we'll do is click next. Applicable notices, you don't have to read that, of course. I don't know anybody who does personally. Now it's installed. Oh, sorry. Now it's asking where do you want to actually install Windows Server. In this case, we've got one hard drive with unallocated space. Go there. And then from this point, the installation process should begin. Alright, so now it is installing Windows Server. This is probably going to take a few minutes. So again, what I'm going to do is go on ahead and pause the recording. And while you're doing this, what I would go on ahead and do is also install Windows 11, and then do like the exact same steps that I did for this virtual machine, like change the network adapter and any other settings. And also, now for Windows 11 in particular, I also recommend using at least 4 gigs of RAM, and you could probably get away with just 2 CPUs. That should be fine. But anyways, I'm going to pause the recording now. Alright, so Windows Server 2025 has officially installed. The only step that I did skip was the part where it asked me to create an initial password for the administrator account. But yeah, once you finish installing, you should just be able to like create a password as soon as it finishes. But anyways, now that we're here on the lock screen for our server, what we can do in VirtualBox is go to Input, Keyboard, Control Alt Delete, and then I'll go on ahead and log in to our Windows Server instance. Should only take a few minutes here. Now, the few things that you do want to focus on when it comes to Windows Server is, I would say, Active Directory and also like creating an actual domain. So what we will do is go on ahead and go through that process. Of course, it's going to ask you for some other stuff. Alright, so this is Windows Server's Server Manager is what you would call it. And so this is the first thing, of course, that'll pop up when you actually install Windows Server. So in order to add functionality to Windows Server, you have to install what are called roles and features. So one of the first things that I would personally do when setting up a new Windows Server is figure out what roles and features I need. In this case, we're going to be looking for a role called Active Directory Users and Computers to start off as well as some additional roles here. But another thing that you're going to need to do is actually configure a domain controller for your environment. And essentially what a domain controller is, it is a server that you rely on to handle any sort of administrative features and requests for your domain. You can go to that domain controller and then essentially control not necessarily everything, but whatever features you do give to that particular server. So in this case here, what we want to do is go to role-based or feature-based installation. And then what we want to do is ask you to select the server from the server pool. This is the server that we just installed, and this is the IP address that my router just gave to this server instance. Ideally, what you actually want to do is have your server configure it with a static IP so that other devices can always reach it without obviously the IP changing, and it can't be reached for various reasons. So, alright, what we'll do is get into the server roles here once this is finished installing. And then once you install a couple of services, what it'll do is actually prompt for the setup of the domain controller that I just mentioned. And so in this particular case, we have only one Windows Server instance, and for HomeLab purposes, I would say that's enough to at least get started. Maybe you want to add another domain controller into your environment and then practice stuff like domain controller replication and stuff like that. But I would say that goes beyond the scope of entry-level IT. But anyways, yeah, just waiting for this to load here. Shouldn't take too long. Let's see. And while this is loading, so once the domain is actually created in your Windows Server environment, what you'll want to do is also add your Windows 11 device to the domain, which I will also show in this video. Okay, so what we want is Active Directory domain services is probably the first feature that we'd want. Let's see what else. You may want to enable DHCP, DNS. Yeah, don't worry about any of these for now. It's just basically confirming what I mentioned earlier about having a static IP. I would say those are the basics for now. There's some other, as you can see, there's plenty of other settings that you can install inside of Active Directory if you want, but we don't need to worry about that for now. For features, let's see, anything crucial in here? I don't really think so, at least not for now. Just taking a quick look. Yeah, I don't think there's anything in here. Alright. Active Directory domain services. This is talking about Yeah, Azure Active Directory. Don't worry about that for now. Um, DNS, DHCP. Okay, so what we will do is go ahead and install this. I think once this is installed, Windows Server will need to, I think it'll need to reboot once domain service is installed, but I can't remember if that requirement was removed or not. But either way, the installation started, so what I'm going to do is just pause the recording now and come back when the installation finishes. Alright guys, so the domain controller, or I guess in this particular case it's not a domain controller yet, but the Windows Server instance actually did not need to be rebooted. So what will happen is once the install finishes, you will see a button, I guess you can call it, that will say promote this server to a domain controller. So I clicked to that, and then that's how I got here to this deployment configuration tool. So what you want to do is you want to add a new forest first. So the way that Active Directory is set up is that you have forests, which is the terminology for a set of different domains that are managed by you as an organization. And then you'll have like trees, and then or I guess you can call them branches, and then you'll actually have your actual domains that hang off of these branches, if that makes sense. So you've got like a tree forest hierarchy, if that makes sense. You'll have several trees in the forest, and these trees will essentially be your different domains. In this case, we're only focused on one domain, so don't worry too much about the whole tree forest architecture right now. Now for the domain, again, this is a test lab, so what I'll just do is something very generic. That should work. Then after that, it'll take us to some other options here. So you've got forest functional level, you've got domain name or DNS server, basically saying the capabilities of the domain controller. You got your global catalog, which this basically enables the domain controller to have access to this catalog that essentially, if you have like multiple domain controllers or multiple domains and you add this domain controller to the global catalog, it'll be able to search for and make queries to other domains that are outside of its primary domain, and then also like share resources and whatnot between domain controllers. Or you can also set it to be a read-only domain controller, in which it can only read attributes, but it can't actually like make administrative changes. So in this particular case, we could leave all of this at Windows Server 2025. Now, I believe for domain functional level, this is specifically talking about Windows Server installation version, or which Windows Server instance version. So if you've got Windows Server 2016, for example, at the forest level, then a domain controller that has this installed will still be able to make administrative changes. So in this particular case here, what we want to do is that directory serves as restore password. So this is a feature that Microsoft has implemented if in the event that's essentially, it's a disaster recovery sort of thing that you would deal with when it comes to protecting your domain controllers and maintaining the integrity of it, because at the end of the day, Active Directory is really just a database of different files and group policy and a bunch of different settings. So alright, click next. We will not worry about this right now, mainly because we do not have DNS installed. NetBIOS is a really old naming nomenclature for like Windows devices, whether it be servers, regular endpoints, etc. I don't think it's really used in depth anymore. I've never really had to worry about like NetBIOS or anything like that. So if you want to do more research on that, I highly recommend it, just so you can be informed. Now, what you have here is, again, as I mentioned before, Active Directory is essentially just a giant database when you think about it. And so this is basically asking, where do you want that database to be stored? So in this case, we're talking about the Windows NTDS folder. I actually forgot what NTDS stands for. Sorry about that. And then of course you have logs, and then sysvol. Now sysvol is going to contain all of your group policy settings. So any changes pertaining to group policy will save in the sysvol folder. All right, click next. This will actually give you a script that you can run in PowerShell so that you can deploy another like Windows Server instance as a domain controller without doing everything that I just did. So I don't really need this, so I'm not gonna save it or anything. And then what I'll do is I'll click next, and then now you'll actually go through the process of promoting this domain controller. I'm sorry, promoting this Windows Server to a domain controller. And then right now it's, as you can see, verifying prerequisites, and then I click install to begin, and then it gives a few warnings here like I mentioned before. Gonna need a static IP for this server, so I'm definitely gonna be configuring that. And then delegation for DNS, yeah, authoritative parent zone cannot be found. Yeah, that's all fine for now. I haven't gotten through the process of actually implementing DNS yet. So now what we'll do is click install. And this will probably take a few minutes. So again, I'm gonna pause the recording and then I'll get back to you guys. Alright, so now we have our domain controller fully up and running, and one way that we can confirm that the domain was actually created is if we go to the CMD, and then if we just run the command who am I, what it'll do is it'll show you that you're part of a domain called test domain or whatever you specify as a domain name, and then you have the administrator account that I created earlier. I also ran an ipconfig command and went on ahead and gave the domain controller a static IP of 192.168.0.7 with a subnet mask of 255.255.255.0, and then the gateway is essentially just my router IP. And the way that you can go to configure this is if you go to networking settings, go to Ethernet, and then go to, let's see, IP assignment. You can just click edit here. You can change this from manual to DHCP, but usually it'll be on DHCP by default. So what you just want to do is set the IP address that you want it to be in, the subnet mask, the IP for your router, which you can figure out from your desktop by running the ipconfig command, and as you can see, it'll give you the default gateway IP address. So that's how you can get that information. Now the reason why this particular IP is going to be important for the Windows 11 client device is because we are actually going to set this as the DNS server on that device so that we can add that device to the test domain. So, and the reason why this is set to 127.0.0.1 is this is called a loopback address, so this is basically just pointing back to itself. So this is essentially saying that this server is the authoritative or an authoritative DNS server for this environment. You want to make sure that you configure this so that you can actually add devices to your domain. So beyond that, what we will do now is actually jump over to our Windows 11 machine, and then we'll add to the domain. So it should work just fine. 1 second here. Alright, so to your left you'll see the Windows 11 device. I already set up all the basic configuration settings. So what we want to do is we actually do not need to worry about giving it a static IP. The only thing that we really want to do is give it a static DNS assignment. So in this particular case, we want the DNS server to be 192.168.0.7. Alternate DNS, this doesn't really matter, but typically, you can use a server like 8.8.8.8, which is just one of Google's DNS servers. So now what we want to do is click save, and now this device should be able to reach the domain controller. But one thing that I want to do before adding it to the domain is seeing if it can, well actually no, never mind, we'll save that for afterwards. it should be able to reach it regardless because it's on a bridged adapter. But anyways, now we'll go on ahead and add this PC or this VM to the domain. So go to rename your PC. Actually, wait, no. Sorry, it's a domain or work group. Back then, you used to be able to also change the domain from that setting. So, all right, now what we'll do is set the domain to, what was it, testdomain.local. And then now it's asking you for a account name that's in the actual domain. So essentially, we're going to be using the administrator account that's on this domain. But if you want to, you can also go into Active Directory users and computers like I mentioned before, and then you can make an account here that has like administrative rights. Of course, I don't have any users in here now because I just made the environment. Well, these are the built-in ones, and then of course you have the built-in administrator account. But you can go through the process of creating your own administrator account if you want. So now what we'll do is we'll just go on ahead and use that administrator account to add this device to the domain. Alright, give that a minute. Oh, well, that was pre-instant, so there you have it. Welcome to the testdomain.local domain. And then of course, what I was going to do is see if I could actually run the ping command, which is essentially just sending ICMP traffic over to, in this case, the target device, which would be the domain controller, to make sure they're on the same network. Yep, it can reach the device. And then also run an IP config to see which IP address this device has. So it was given 0.31 through DHCP. Alright, cool. So now you have this device on the domain. They're on the same network. They can communicate with each other. And so the reason why this becomes important is because then you can start incorporating things like group policy, for example. And then what should also happen is that, I'm not sure if it's already in here, but yeah, I think this is a computer object that was automatically added for that particular user endpoint in the domain so they can be recognized through DNS and whatnot. So of course you can also change some security settings on here as well for this particular endpoint and various other things. So that's how you can get started with creating a IT home lab. Another couple of things that I just wanted to talk about is a little bit more about DNS. So as I mentioned in a previous video, specifically the 5 skills that you need to get into IT, DNS is essentially a phone book for the internet, and what I mean by that is it enables domain names to be resolved into IP addresses. And so computers, whether it be desktops, servers, or whatnot, they read domain names through IP addresses. And so if you go into DNS Manager and go into forward lookup zones, and then we'll go to our domain that we just created, you'll see a couple of records. So you'll see an A record. This is called a host record. As you can see, it contains the IP address for this server. But then you also have a start of authority and a name server. Now, a name server is used specifically in DNS servers to tell other DNS servers that the entry that's in this record has authoritative rights to edit the DNS database inside of what you would call the DNS zone. In this case, a DNS zone is just a record of DNS records that are for a particular domain. So in this particular case, we're talking about testdomain.local. And then this is the name server. Well, not the name server. This is the authoritative DNS server. This is basically just this server because it's the authoritative DNS server for this domain because we don't have any other servers set up. And so there's other types of records like MX records and service records. So MX records are used specifically for like Microsoft Exchange, for example. And then you have service records which point to specific services in your environment. So that's DNS. Just a quick overview. I highly recommend exploring DNS a little bit further as you're doing your home lab. Now another thing is for DHCP. The only thing that I really want to mention about DHCP is that just remember what DHCP is. It's a mechanism that's used to automatically assign IP addresses to your environment. So you have DHCP leases, you have DHCP restrictions, quite a few things within the DHCP scope. I don't want to get too deeply into DHCP now because I don't want the video to be too long. But essentially, like, you can add a DHCP scope. So basically, like a set number of IP addresses that you want to distribute to user devices, and then you can also set restrictions and whatnot. But honestly, guys, I appreciate you sticking with me for this long. I think that's going to be the end of this video. As usual, I appreciate you guys watching. What I'm going to do is, again, set a link to both VirtualBox and the two like evaluation center VMs in the description of the video. And then honestly, if you guys want me to like cover anything else when it comes to getting started in IT, and maybe some HomeLab recommendations, etc., or if you even want me to go over how you can actually like combine both on-premises Active Directory, which is basically what I just configured, to like Microsoft Azure, that I can go over that as well, because that's not a lengthy process, but it does require some steps and having some knowledge of how the architecture works. But anyways, yeah, that's pretty much going to be it. As usual, thank you for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one.